Alison, in trying to understand free will, you've taken a developmental psychology approach, studying very young children. Some people will think that's not relevant to free will because free will is this big adult concept of philosophers and neuroscientists doing their work. Tell me about some of the experiments you've done and how they really do differentiate aspects of free will that sometimes we conflate together.
Well, of course, the great challenge of doing this kind of developmental psychology is how do you actually figure out what very young children and even babies are thinking about. So I started my career as a philosopher, and it's easy to say as a philosopher, it would be nice to know how we develop these ideas, but how do we actually do this for real with 3- and 4-year-olds? And if we went to a 3- and 4-year-old and said, are you a compatibilist or a libertarian, we wouldn't get anything that was very articulate. So what we did was take what we think is a really central notion of free will, which is this idea about choice and about being able to do otherwise. And you can articulate that in a way that even 4-year-olds will understand. So you can simply ask a straightforward question. Could you have chosen, did you have to do this, or could you have chosen to do this other thing? And one of the things we've discovered with 4-year-olds is if you just give them an open-ended question, what you'll get is a beautiful poem about ponies and birthdays and things, but you won't get anything that looks very rational, which is why for a long time people thought that preschool children were irrational and amoral and couldn't understand these things. But if you ask them a focused question where there's just 2 alternatives, could he have stayed on the stool, or could he have gone down to the floor? Then children are much better, and they actually turn out to be strikingly rational. So what we did was take this very basic, simple question: could you have done X, or could you have chosen to do X, or did you have to do Y? And then asked that question in many different kinds of domains and about many different kinds of situations. And one of the advantages of doing that is we know that then if children say no in some cases and yes in others, it isn't just because, say, they didn't understand the question, or they always said yes or they always said no. So we started out with the sort of simplest case. Oh, and we also wanted to ask children about both themselves and other people. Because another really deep philosophical question you could ask is your understanding of something like free will deeply rooted in your own experiences, or is it something that you start to understand by watching what other people are doing in a social context, and then you apply it to your own experience?
So give me some specific examples of what you would ask.
So the first set of questions we asked were about these physical constraints. So we asked simple things like, suppose that Johnny is standing on a stool, and Johnny wants to step off the stool onto the ground. Can he choose to step off the stool onto the ground, or off the stool and onto the ground, or does he have to stay on the stool? And there's a case where free will says, well, he can stay on the stool, but he could also choose to go to the ground. Then we asked almost exactly the same question with just a little twist. So we said, all right, suppose Johnny's on the stool, and he wants to step off the stool and just float in thin air. Can he... does he have to stay on the stool? Does he have to go down to the ground? Or can he just float in thin air? So notice that the questions are about the same things. The actual outcome is the same. But this difference about physical impossibility gives you the contrast between a free case where you have a choice and a case where you're constrained. So you can't actually choose to just float in the air. And what we discovered was that even very young children in our experiments, 4-year-olds in other experiments that Henry Wellman did, even 2- and 3-year-olds, get that. They say, you can't just choose to float, but if you want to choose to go down to the ground, you can. And we give the children a whole bunch of examples like this, and the children are extremely good at doing this, get that differentiation really clearly.
The physical impossibility, the constraint.
Exactly.
They understand.
Now, here's another kind of constraint, which you might think of as being a kind of epistemic constraint. And this is work that my colleague Tamara Kushner and Nadia Chernak did. So you could also ask, how about if he wants to draw a picture of a monkey, but he's never seen a monkey? He doesn't know what a monkey looks like. Could he just choose to draw the picture of the monkey? Versus he knows all about monkeys. He wants to draw a picture of the monkey. Could he choose to draw the monkey, or does he have to draw something else? And again, when you look at even very young children, 4-year-olds will say, well, if he has seen and knows about monkeys, then he can draw them. But if he doesn't know about monkeys, he can't draw them. Now, those are both questions about other people. How could you ask the question sort of more vividly about yourself? And again, Tamara and Nadia thought of a nice way of doing this. So here's the way that the experiment goes. The child's supposed to draw something. And you can either draw a dot or you can draw a line. So you say to the child, you can draw a dot or you can draw a line. And in one condition, what happens is the experimenter says, I'm going to hold this piece of paper really, really tightly here. And you can draw either a dot or a line. In the other condition, the experimenter says, I'm going to hold your hand really tightly. And you can draw either a dot or a line. Now, obviously, if your hand's being held, you can't actually draw a line. You have to draw a dot. So the children did this, and then we asked them afterwards, well, could you have done otherwise? Could you have drawn a dot instead of a line, or a line instead of a dot when I was holding the paper? Could you have drawn a line when I was holding your hand? And again, even 4-year-olds are very accurate at saying you couldn't draw a line if you were under a physical constraint, but you could draw a line if you were free. And the same way with an epistemic case. So in the epistemic case, what happened was that the experimenter had a picture, and it was either behind a screen or not. And then the experimenter said, could you draw something different from what I drew? And the children draw something. And then the question was, could you have drawn something that was the same as what I drew? And of course, if you can't see what the experimenter does, then you couldn't do it. But if you could see, then you could. And we also asked the children at the end of these experiments, why is that? Why is it that you could draw the line in one case and you couldn't draw the line in the other case? And again, 4-year-olds extremely good and accurate at doing this, and not only good and accurate at making the distinctions, but at explaining them. So they said, well, you couldn't draw the thing that was the same because you couldn't see what was behind there, and you couldn't draw the line because your hand was being held and you had to draw the dot. So that means that even in your own case, where you might imagine that children would have the illusion, say, that their action itself was any action that they performed was the result of their free will, we don't see that. So children are not, say, confabulating and saying anything that I do is going to be freely willed. They seem to be very good at knowing which situations are the ones in which they were free and which situations were the ones in which
Is
they
there
were
a differentiation between the physical constraint and the epistemic constraint?
No, which is interesting. We thought maybe the physical constraint would come in first,
right.
But in fact, for these 4-year-olds, they're just as good at understanding the epistemic or the mental constraint as they are at understanding the physical constraint. So again, these are 4-year-olds. They're not adding yet. They're not subtracting. If you and I both got grandchildren, they're pretty little. They haven't gone to school. They haven't definitely haven't taken any philosophy classes, but they've already seemed to have a lot of the pieces about choice, being able to do otherwise, constraint, lack of constraint in place. So you might think, if you were a certain kind of philosopher or psychologist, you might say, oh, okay, well, our notion of free will is innate. We've got it all there. But how about there are other kind of more complicated ideas that you might have about free will. So as adult philosophers, we also think that we can freely decide to do something that's against our own desires. So we think that we might want to do something, and we might even want to do it really badly, but we can simply, as a matter of will, decide that we're not going to do this thing that we really want to do. Or conversely, we can think that we can force ourselves, just as a matter of will, to go out and do something that we don't want to do. And in fact, we think that that might be for an alternative reason. We don't want to eat the cookie because we don't want to get fat. But I think it's important to our adult sense that we think we just existentially decide not to do the thing that we want to do. There's this kind of place where we can do that. So how could we test that with children? Well, what we did was to give them scenarios where someone wants to do something. So here's Johnny. There's a cookie. Look at this cookie. It's delicious. He really likes it. He really wants to eat it. It turned out that we had to say his mom says it's okay for him to eat the cookie because children treat moms as the ultimate constraint in the universe, like God, the omnipotent controller of their destinies. Mom says it's okay. Can he just decide not to eat the cookie, or does he have to eat the cookie? And we did the same thing the other way around. So we had examples like there's the closet, and he's kind of scared about what's in the closet. He thinks it might be something scary. He doesn't want to open the closet door. Can he just decide that he's going to go and open the closet door? And what we discovered there was something quite different. So what we discovered was that now the 4-year-olds were much more likely to say, he can't open the door, and he can't not eat the cookie. He can't refrain from eating the cookie. So even though the language was exactly the same, they got the idea about doing otherwise, they said, no, you couldn't do otherwise if it involved acting against your desires. And that was particularly true in the case of the inhibition. So they especially said that they were especially likely to say you couldn't choose not to eat the delicious cookie. And we asked them about the other, how about the self? What we discovered was that when we asked them about the self, so we said, what's something that you really like to eat? What's something you really don't like to eat? What's something you're scared of? What's something that you're really curious about? We discovered that when we asked them about the self, they had an even stronger intuition that they couldn't act against their desires. So they were actually better at attributing free will to other people in this context than to themselves. And again, it may be that they were actually being more accurate than we are, right? I mean, they probably had a pretty good picture about what they could do and what they couldn't do. So again, somewhat counterintuitively, they actually thought that other people had more free will than they actually did themselves.
And when does that change?
So we did this with 4-year-olds and 6-year-olds. When we went to the 6-year-olds looked like adults. So the 6-year-olds said, it doesn't matter what you want, you can just arbitrarily decide at the last minute that you want something else. Even if you're scared of the closet, you can just decide that you're going to go and look in the closet. And even more interestingly, we looked at the children's justifications, their explanations for why it was that you could do this. And as you might imagine, the 4-year-old said, well, you can't do it because you don't want the cookie. They referred to your desires. The 6-year-olds sometimes referred to your desires, but the way they justified the fact that you could do it was either by talking about counterfactual possibilities. The world could have been otherwise. It could be that you really had liked the cookies. Which is interesting because lots of philosophers have argued that ability to think counterfactually about possibilities is connected to our ideas about free will. Or else, a lot of them just gave autonomy explanations. They said things like, well, he's the boss of himself. He's the only person, she's the only person in charge of her brain. I can decide what it is that I want to do.
Amazing.
Often with a lot of the kind of, powerful affect that you hear philosophers give in discussions of free will. So the 6-year-old seemed to have the idea that, look, I am just a free agent. I'm autonomous. I can do what I want. And that includes being able to actually act against my own desires. So the 6-year-olds, if we had just interviewed the 6-year-olds, we might have said, oh, see, this notion is there in place from very early on. But when you look at the 4-year-olds who understand the question, can answer these other questions about, say, physical constraint, they're looking very different. They're not appealing to these general autonomy explanations. So we didn't find any autonomy explanations among the 4-year-olds. The 4-year-olds didn't seem to have this idea about, I'm just free and I can do whatever I want in the way that at least many of the 6-year-olds did. So the 4-year-old idea about free will seemed to be really about choice, about belief and desire, but they hadn't yet gotten this piece about the way that free will might actually involve interventions on your own desires, might involve actually doing things that went against it involves a notion of control that can include control over yourself as well as control over the external world. So for us, the notion of free will, and importantly, I think for adults, in contexts like moral responsibility, for example, is that we not only have control over the things that we manipulate in the world, but we have control over our own minds. Even when we want to do something, we can decide not to do that, or we can decide to do it. So by asking these very simple questions, can you choose to do this? Do you have to do something else, about things like monsters in the closet and curiosity and cookies, we could show that some of the pieces of this concept seem to be in place really early, in some ways much earlier than we would have expected, and other pieces didn't seem to be in place till much later. And rather surprisingly, the children actually seemed to have a more adult-like notion of free will when they were thinking about other people than when they were thinking about themselves. And that's also interesting because some neuroscientists and philosophers have suggested that the sort of physical experience of your own volition is really the key to your notion of free will. And that doesn't seem to be so clear when we're looking at the children. It may be that things about watching other people's choices and constraints are playing a greater role than their own internal sensations about what they can do and what they can't do.